Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, people talk about zombies stalking the globe. In fact, one exists, and he's terrorizing America.
Max, I have a feeling you're talking about Dick Cheney, of course. And he's a good walking symbol of what happens when one continues to look forward and never looking back, when justice is never delivered, when criminals are allowed to stalk the earth. And we see that with the banking sector, but he's a good example of what happens with the political and war crime sector. So let's turn to a little clip of him in the past few weeks. This is him on NBC promoting his book.
People call it torture. You think it should still be a tool?
Yes.
Secret prisons?
Yes.
Wiretapping?
Well, with the right approval.
You say it is one of the things you are proudest of, and you would do it again in a heartbeat.
It was controversial at the time. It was the right thing to do.
Dick Cheney is a pox on our soul. He has embarrassed and shamed Americans.
Well, Max, you know, he said in a heartbeat he would once again overthrow habeas corpus. He would once again tap the phones of Americans despite what the Constitution says he's allowed to do. Of course, Dick Cheney technically does not have a heartbeat, by the way. There's just one flow of blood because he has an artificial pump in his heart. So it's just a constant flow of blood. And it makes me think of it's a great analogy for the financial system where it's just a steady stream of currency being pushed to the bankers. And also in a system in which bankers have committed massive crimes against capital, and yet they're able to walk freely. So let's look at this headline to see what's reemerged, just like Cheney. Iceland revives carry trade on lower risk. So Iceland raised...
Wait a minute, what's that? Hey, whoa, hello, what, repeat that.
Yes, you know the carry trade that destroyed Iceland?
Yeah, of course.
Well, apparently it's coming back because Iceland raised its main interest rate by a quarter point on August 17th to 4.5%. This is the first time in 3 years since their banking system collapsed because of...
the carry trade.
Yes. Okay. So now they've raised rates again. And they're also removing capital controls, which they brought in 2008 once their currency started to collapse. So there's $4.3 billion trapped in the country from prior to the collapse. But because they're opening, they're expecting actually more money to come in because of the carry trade.
Yeah, just to review here, people would borrow money in Japan or from Switzerland at the ultra-low rates, deposit it in Iceland, pick up some extra interest rate on that deposit as an interest rate arbitrage. This attracted a lot of capital, which of course the country used to float 10 times the country's GDP in debt. And this is what killed Iceland. So you're saying that after 4 years, and after beating the banks finally, and after the krona collapsing, that they think it's a good idea to restart the carry trade?
Well, some people do, and I want to put into context. I'll show you how big the carry trade was. According to the article, monthly krona flows peaked at 1.2 trillion krona, which is the equivalent of 10.6 billion in March 2008. 7 months before Iceland's biggest banks failed. Iceland's GDP that year was 1.5 trillion.
Yeah, well, the big controversy between Iceland, Netherlands, and Britain, of course, revolving around IceSave, the savings account, which involved these artificially high interest rates that were created to suck capital into the country, which they used to collateralize 10 times that value in debt to buy a lot of ridiculously overpriced assets in the UK, like the West Ham Football Club. I didn't know that West Ham had a football club, and why is Iceland buying it?
Well, Max, there is one man who's warning everybody in Iceland, don't let the carry trade happen again. His name? Oscar Johnson.
Wait a minute. That sounds awfully familiar. Oscar Johnson? Wait a minute. Isn't this the guy we talked to the year before Iceland collapsed and warned him against the carry trade? Now he's warning...
Exactly. Max Keiser, you made a film called Money Geyser, and you went to Iceland. You spoke to Oscar Johnson. He, at the time, was the chief researcher and economist for Kaupthing Bank, which has since collapsed. He at the time said on several occasions, the carry trade is not a problem. It is not a problem. There is no hot money in this country. Today, he says, quote, the central bank has stated that it wants to open the door to the carry trade. As greed knows no boundaries, carry traders will always return as long as the yield is favorable.
That's right. They will always return. It's moral hazard. It's baked into the cake. This guy, Oscar Johnson, he sounds like a guy who worked at a meatpacking plant who becomes a vegetarian. Essentially, this is what happens. When you see what goes on inside these banks, you start to vomit and puke because it's just larceny on a wholesale industrial scale.
Well, Max, you interviewed him in April of 2007. And I want to point to another little clip from this film. The world we see around us in Europe, listen to the question you asked him.
Do you think the people in Europe would ever want to revolt again if they thought that their banking community was treating them like feudal lords, catering to speculative, buccaneering interest rate arbitrageurs instead of maybe servicing their needs as a democratic people?
That is a good question. You should ask Le Pen or some other figure.
Le Pen?
Yeah.
Well, Oscar was wrong about that, too.
I think you have the last laugh on that one.
Of course the people are going to rise up.
Well, so of course they're rising up across Europe due to these banks that just won't learn their lesson because we won't punish them. In fact, we coddle them whenever they make a grand larcenistic fault. So let's move on to another headline along the same line where bankers just don't learn their lesson. Take bloggers' bank warning with several grains of salt. So this is the Globe and Mail, and they're referring to Zero Hedge, in which they blogged about Canadian banks and warned that they're on the verge of collapse because the tangible common equity ratio, which the blogger used to draw up his list, compares tangible assets, things such as loans, cash, and buildings, to common shareholders' equity. The blogger's point was that a smallish write-off of 3 or 4% of assets would wipe out shareholders. So, Max, this Globe and Mail article says that this isn't a problem in Canada. Why? Because, first of all banks are highly leveraged. So what's the big deal about Canada?
Right, that's right. They're speaking out of their morally hazarded butthole.
Yeah, but we also saw what happened to all those other highly leveraged banks, like Bear Stearns, like Lehman Brothers. Yes, they indeed were highly leveraged. Do they live today? No, they are dead. So here's another point he makes why Canadian banks won't collapse. Because he said they have intangible assets, like their brand value. And Canadian banks, he says, quote, are an oligopoly. They won't admit it, but it's true. They're pretty friendly. They don't compete too hard as U.S. banks do.
Right. They don't have to compete. It is an oligopoly. They also have an entrenched captive audience that is forced to do business with them. It is a moral hazard situation. And, of course, they are going to collapse. The reason why they haven't collapsed yet is because Canadian banks already collapsed in the early 1990s. That's when they destroyed all the competition and brought in the kleptocracy, the oligopoly in the Canadian banking system. And so to say that they're safe because pointing to the very risks and liabilities as assets gives you an idea of how you value banks these days. All of the risks and the liabilities are considered assets, and all the customers that provide the actual liquidity for the capital per something called capitalism are expendable and disposable and treated like garbage. Now, these banks are going to collapse. Why? Because the Canadian real estate market's going to collapse. Why? Because Vancouver is like Japan in 1989, Tokyo in 1989. The Alberta oil fields, the tar sands are stretched, and that Trans-Canada pipeline is going to be shut down by activists anyway. So this country's going down the tubes. And I love the fact that Business Insider, Henry Blodgett's site, has recently put forward the idea of actually having Canada and America join to create a global North American United States Union as a way to extend and pretend. Take Canada's debt and American debt, create new North American debt, similar to what we're seeing in the Eurozone. This is part of the New World Order, as some call it. Just create a global debt market, put all your local debts into it, put it out for 100 years, and pretend like it'll go away. Oh, and by the way, impose austerity measures in getting deeper and deeper every single day along the way.
Well, Max, he goes on one further, and this is like the Marie Antoinette moment, the moment where he's taunting us, because he said the Canadian banks won't collapse also because they enjoy a cozy relationship with the government. So they get effective subsidies from Ottawa in the form of Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which insures risky mortgages and buys others. So it's quite possible that if the housing market turns really ugly, the taxpayer will be forced to write a check.
Yeah, we saw this in Australia last year. Remember, Steve Keen was talking about the Australian real estate market collapse. While it was collapsing, government came in, offered subsidies, stopped the collapse for a few months. Now it's collapsing again. The Canadian government will come in, again, morally hazardous because the Canadian government is in bed with the Canadian banks. They'll offer a subsidy. That'll stop the rot for a few months, and then it'll collapse anyway.
And, of course, so nothing's being done, and more debt is being loaded up onto our economies, onto the sovereign debt. I see this headline here, Max.
Yes.
Europe's wealthiest raise their voices in favor of higher taxes. Now, the subtitle says, as fear of social unrest grows, an offer to take on a bigger burden.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, Max, they, of course, know they have hundreds and hundreds of years of history in Europe where bankers and oligarchs and kleptocrats and monarchs have lost their heads, precisely due because there was no justice was ever allowed for the people who stole if they were well connected, if they were connected to the Sun King, if they were connected to the oligarchs in power. So there was no recourse for the peasants here but to cut off the head. So now you have, in France, the French people are demanding, because Sarkozy keeps on giving them tax cuts and tax breaks, they're like, please, it's getting embarrassing and a little bit dangerous for us.
Right. The rich here in Europe know that there are limits before you engender social unrest, and a visit down there to see Monsieur Guillotine. And they are sensitive to this type of thing. America hasn't had that experience yet. So it's a very immature country that haven't had a real popular uprising in its history where the poor they're actually chopping the heads off of the rich.
And so, finally, Max, I have a good idea here. This is a good example to follow. Short take, Illinois budget stiffs the dead. So, as part of trying to make ends meet, the Illinois state government will suspend its practice of paying $1,655 to funeral homes that bury the approximately 12,000 public aid recipients who die each year. Now, instead, they're going to leave them in cold storage, cremate them, or bury them in a plywood box in a potter's field. Otherwise, the governor would have to take $13 million or so from some program for the living to take care of the dead. And that's exactly what you see happening in the world. Austerity measures are taking money from the living to give to the dead banks. I say we put all of these banks into a plywood box, bury them in the Bois de Boulogne, and just get rid of them.
Hear, hear! Stacy Herbert. Totally agreed. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
That's going to do it for this portion of the show. Stay tuned. Much more coming away, so stay right there.
Observe nature and discover its beauty. Communicate with the wild and learn. Test yourself and become free. See what nature can give you on RT.
Welcome to the future, bringing you the latest in science and technology from around Russia.
We've got the future covered.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to sunny Los Angeles and speak with Mike Maloney of goldsilver.com. Mike Maloney, welcome to our first ever Saturday edition of the Keiser Report.
I'm honored, Max.
All right, Mike Maloney, let me ask you this. Ben Bernanke has promised to keep interest rates at near zero for the next 2 years. What will this do to the economy and to the dollar?
You know, I said before that Ben Bernanke is dumber than gold. Gold automatically balances interest rates. It balances currency inflows and outflows, trade imbalances. This was something that didn't take a group of men trying to figure these things out. What we've got is a monetary system that is a Ponzi scheme. It steals wealth from the middle class and transfers that wealth to the government and the banking sector. These people get to ride for free because what they're doing by printing more currency and diluting the currency supply all the time. And this is what zero interest rates will do. It'll expand the currency supply. When they do this, it dilutes the currency supply and causes the purchasing power to go down. People call it inflation. It's the dollar losing purchasing power. And this goes down just because there's more and more and more units of currency out there. So basically, you know, he's on the path of destroying the dollar.
The average lifespan of a fiat currency, I just learned this, is 27 years. So the U.S. dollar, being a fiat currency, has been around for 40 years. It seems like it's overdue to be replaced and bring back something of tangible value like the gold standard. You've been talking about this for quite some time. Talk to us a little bit about how you transition to a gold standard. In other words, you've got a lot of fiat money out there. Do you need to figure out the ratio between fiat money and the available gold and the money supply, for example, in the U.S.? How does that factor into a transition?
Well, you know, when I was writing, this is one of the chapters that was actually cut out of my book. My book was 2.5 years of research and editing, but actually the research was 6 years because it goes back to the beginning of when I got into this, really. And one of the things that I did as an exercise, when I was writing back in 2006 roughly, I went and found what would it take to instill confidence once again in the U.S. dollar if the U.S. dollar was going into a hyperinflation or there was a crisis of confidence. And basically, I believe that that would take something like the Bretton Woods system, where the U.S. dollar would be redeemable in gold, but to foreign central banks only. Because believe me, when this current monetary system starts to fall apart, they're going to want to try and run some scam on us again, and only back. They're going to try and back the fewest dollars possible with gold. And so by making foreign central banks only eligible to redeem their gold, that's the way of cheating the most, cheating gold the most, by making the fewest dollars possible redeemable in gold. When I did this, what I did was found out how many dollars are held by foreign central banks, and you just divide it by the ounces of gold that the Treasury claims to own. They may not, all of the gold that the U.S. supposedly has was turned over to the Federal Reserve in 1934, and the Treasury has a bunch of $100,000 gold notes, pieces of paper that say, "I owe you gold," from the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve has all the gold, and the Federal Reserve can't be audited. So what they've done with it over the decades in between, we have no idea, but Alan Greenspan admitted in testimony to Congress in 1996 that the world's central banks were leasing gold to suppress its price, to keep gold's price down. So whether or not the U.S. actually has the gold, that's very questionable. But if they did have all the gold that they said they did, then the price of gold has to rise to about $20,000 per ounce. When I did the exercise, it was $19,837 or something like that per ounce for the Treasury to have enough gold to cover every dollar that foreign central banks are holding. Now, if currencies were to fail and you were just to replace all of the dollars out there with gold, it requires a price around $203,000 per ounce if you were going to just replace all of the currency with gold. I'm not saying that these are these are prices that gold is going to, but gold is still extremely undervalued at this point. And I think that Ben Bernanke's policies basically say that the dollar is doomed. He's willing to sacrifice the dollar to save the economy, but when he sacrifices the dollar, ultimately it's going to ruin the economy. It's a short-term fix. It's a Band-Aid it's a Band-Aid that's going to leak.
Okay, so to come up with a price of gold that would satisfy the outstanding claims, fiat currency. You're using the dollars held by foreign banks to come up with your ratio of how that would play out. Others are looking at the U.S. money supply. They look at M1 or M2 as that number is reported, and they come up with similar numbers, anywhere between $5,000 to $15,000 per ounce. Now, is there? It may seem a bit technical, but is there any? How would you contrast these two methodologies of using as your, I guess it would be your numerator, either the cash held in foreign banks or, let's say, the M2 money supply? Does it matter at all, or would you make a contrast these two?
Well, when I wrote my book, in my book I've got some graphs that are generated from information from the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. And what it shows is that the base money in the country, the money that's created by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury in sort of a hocus-pocus scam that they've got going, they ramped that up for World War I. And so there were more claim checks on gold than gold that existed. Our currency used to be a claim check on gold. And then we go along and there's bank runs in the 30s, and then they allow the dollar to float, and the dollar's value sank until gold's price rose from $20 to $35 an ounce. And in doing so, there was enough gold at the Treasury to once again back every dollar ever printed from George Washington to Roosevelt. Then we printed a bunch more claim checks on gold. And by 1971, there were too many claim checks out there and not enough gold. Charles de Gaulle had been asking for gold for several years, the president of France, and gold was flowing out of the Treasury, and Nixon had to take us off of gold. He ended the Bretton Woods system. And once again, the will of the public and the free markets bid the price of gold up until for a year there was more, the value of the gold at the Treasury was greater than the value of all the dollars ever printed, and it also covered outstanding revolving credit, unpaid credit card balances. The credit cards are replacing cash in circulation. And for that same thing to happen today, for history to repeat, and the same thing that happened in 1934 and in 1980, it requires $15,000 to $20,000 per ounce gold. When I wrote my book, it was only $6,000 that it required. But Ben Bernanke created all of this excess base money. In just the past 2.5 years, base money has gone from $825 billion to just a breath away from $3 trillion. So we've created more paper currency, basically, in the last 3 years, 4 times more than in the past 200 years. And if gold rises to meet that, again, like it did in 1934 and in 1980, it's $15,000 to $20,000 per ounce gold.
Right, so going back to 1980, when gold was $800 an ounce, the ratio coverage to paper claims to gold was roughly 1-to-1. Right now, it's about 15% coverage.
Yeah, it was over 1-to-1 for a while. It was actually up at about 1.2 to 1. So there was more, the value of the gold at the Treasury exceeded the value of all of the currency created. But right now it's about 12%, and if you add outstanding revolving credit, because credit cards are replacing cash in circulation. And when I charge something on a credit card, I expand the currency supply of the planet, and the merchant that I am paying, his checking account can't tell the difference between a dollar I created or a dollar that the Federal Reserve created. And that dollar circulates until somebody saves it up and pays down credit card debt. When you take this into account, the currency that the public is creating, outstanding revolving credit, then we're at about 8% coverage. So the gold has to rise tremendously to cover all of these all of this excess currency.
I've asked a couple of people this. Maybe you know the answer. You talked about credit cards and how that factors into this money supply number. Do you know, how do food stamps fit into this? Because it seems like food stamps are part of a black market, that nobody really talks about the food stamps out there. The fact you've got 40 or 50 million people in America using food stamps, how does that factor into the growth of money supply?
Well, you got me there, Max. This is something I never thought of even studying, but I'm going to now, because that is important. It's another form of counterfeit money that they're just counterfeit currency that they're just creating out of thin air.
I want to ask you one last question. Christine Lagarde, the new IMF chief, she was speaking to the IMF at Jackson Hole, the Jackson Hole gathering with Ben Bernanke and other central bankers, And one of her big points there was that policymakers have to do everything they possibly can to keep house prices from falling further. What are your thoughts on this point?
My thoughts are they won't let the free markets work. Real estate got into a bubble because of policymakers trying to manipulate things. They were trying to keep the stock markets from seeking equilibrium and going back to realistic PE ratios and dividend yields. They pushed it into a bubble. The bubble popped. Nobody likes a recession, so the government comes in to save us, and they try and push the stock market back up by lowering interest rates and accidentally create a housing bubble. They're going to create some other bubble, regardless of what actions they take. We have a monetary system that is at fault for this. We are using a Ponzi scheme monetary system that isn't a free market monetary system. If we allowed the free market to once again select what money was and what the price of money is, the price of money is interest rates. The interest rates would be different, and the free markets always select gold and silver. You know, I don't care about gold and silver that much. I don't want to try and come back to some gold standard. In fact, I wrote an article once called Gold Standards Suck. A gold standard is a national currency that's supposedly backed by gold. And it just opens the window for all these scams to be run on us again. If you just used gold, gold is what the free market selects. Gold and silver are the two forms of money that the free market selects.
Right, gold itself is not a panacea. You still have the possibility of these multi-level schemes infiltrating the system. However, there is some accountability with gold, which you don't have with any other paper money. Mike Maloney of goldsilver.com. That's all the time for we have with Keiser Report this week. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Max.
Okay, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Mike Maloney of goldsilver.com. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.